G'day, Professor Joseph Drew here, speaking to you from the Moonby campus of the University of Newcastle. Look, I'm aware that not everyone can get to those public forums in the middle of October, so I'm going to make a video of everything I intend on saying on that night. And if you watch it all the way through to the end, you'll still get to fill in the citizen survey. So, enjoy. I just want to remind you about who wrote this report. It was the three professors, not the three amigos. It was myself. You can check out my scholarly record and my books on Google Scholar. It's Professor Ferreira in IST in Portugal, and it's Professor Miyazaki in Japan. Your counsellors correctly went to scholars. Scholars are searchers of the truth, and they're very jealous and precious about their reputations, and they can't be pushed into telling a certain story because they think their reputations are the most valuable things they have. So bear that in mind, please, when you're reading all the report. And to the point is the quote that I often start most of my forums with from Moses Ben Maimonides, my favorite natural law philosopher, physician to Salahuddin, the dude that kicked the Crusaders out of the Holy Land, and an all-round good guy. In his most famous book, The Guide for the Perplexed, he writes this sentence, which I'll paraphrase. Truth is the truth. Whether you all agree or you ever all disagree, it's still going to be the truth. And that's exactly what you're getting at tonight. You will disagree with some of it, and I'm sorry, but the sophisticated mathematical techniques and the evidence that we rely on, fully outlined in the massive report that you'll eventually get to see, will convince you of the fact that these things are the truth. We need to accept them and move forward in a positive way for a brighter future. But before I get into numbers and facts, we need to ask the most important question, much more important than how much money you've got in the bank and how many staff you have and what your state of your assets are and all these sorts of things, is why do we have government? Chances are you've never asked yourself that question before. And there's a few answers to it, and the best answer is probably given by this bloke here, Aristotle. We have government because no one's self-sufficient. We need to get together and cooperate to get some things done. It's as simple as that. And that's what I want you to remember is the purpose of government. Unfortunately, in recent years, federal governments and state governments and some councils have been giving you the perception that government's Santa. You put things on your wish list, they turn up under the tree on Christmas Day, and you never have to pay for them. Well, that's just plain not realistic, I'm afraid. We all have to cooperate. We cooperate in getting the things we need together, but we cooperate in bearing the burden. Someone has to pay, and if we don't pay, your children will. And the third picture here is Pope Pius, who came up with the principle of subsidiarity, which I go into the report. Incredibly important. And basically, he had the same concern that I have and some of your councillors have, which is that in the past, a lot of volunteer organisations did an awful lot of things. And over time, more and more, governments encroached into the territory and taken over those things. And the problem with that is those volunteer organisations then wither and die because they become irrelevant. The bigger problem, as Pope Pius said in 1891, is that if we continue to take on burdens which we need not take on, eventually we'll be crushed under the weight of those burdens that we took on. And that's exactly what's happening in the Western world. That's what's happening in Australia, $1 trillion debt. We can't keep taking over things that aren't the proper function of government. We can't keep delivering wants as a Christmas wish list without paying for them. Eventually, someone has to pay, and eventually we need to get back to basics and remember what government's about. It's cooperating together, mostly in the pursuit of our needs. So we're about to get started. There's 3 questions I'm going to ask, and the first question is, where are we now? What is our financial situation now? Before I do that, can I just please get you to think a little bit about the position of the counsellors and the senior staff? When they engage me, when any council rings me up, I do this great big rant, and I say, well, I'm a professor, I'm not a consultant, I get nothing out of it, my university does, I don't. And indeed, it draws me away from the tasks that I need to do, such as writing books and papers and teaching, to keep my job. And the report that I write will be the truth whether you like it or not. You'll get opportunity to feedback, but at the end of the day, if I don't agree with you, it's not going in the report. And you know what? About half the councillors that ring me go, okay then, bye-bye. And that's fine. Your council didn't. Can you at least give your councillors and senior staff some credit for pursuing the truth, for being brave enough to open themselves up to a truly independent report? And here's the letter of assurance from Professor Miyazaki, and you can read it yourself if you can see the small writing. Otherwise, it will be on the final report, and the final report will be a public document and probably be the first piece of paper you see after the title page. Okay, so what is the deal? Well, I speak plain, and there's no point pretending that things aren't what they are. We can all read the financial statements, we can all read a graph, and I'll go through it in a second. You are in a situation where you have a serious fiscal challenge, and you'll have to make some serious decisions. But I am confident that we have the right people there, and we can chart a course forward. So in this graph that's in front of you, I plot what's happened to your operating result from 2013 through to 2022. Now there's two lines on that graph. There's this blue line up here, and there's an orange line down here. Now, why are there two different operating results? First of all, what is an operating result? It's your revenue or your income, take away your expenses. Now, the two results is that the blue one includes something called capital grants, and I'll explain it in a minute, and the orange line does not include those capital grants. The orange line is the much more accurate one for you to be looking at, and that's where I want you to focus your attention. Now, let me explain why. These capital grants, what are they? It's when the council gets given money to build a certain thing or to buy a certain thing from the state government, sometimes the federal government. Now, by law, they have to spend the money on what they were given it for. So it's like this. If I gave you $50 to go down to the bottle shop and get me a carton of beer, would you be $50 better off? No, you would not. Not if you have the intention of buying the beer and coming back to me. In fact, you'll discover what our councillors keep discovering across the state, which is that by the time you get to the bottle shop, $50 isn't going to cut it. The beer I drink is Kirin. It's about $80 a box, so you'll be pulling $30 out of your pocket. And this is how capital grants work. So they cloud matters, and they make it really hard for us to see what's going on. And that's been part of the problem, these huge capital grants. And they also create a burden for us in the future, as I'll go through in slides later. Now let's then look at the orange line that doesn't include these capital grants. And you can see after amalgamation, it was positive, and that's where we want to see it. On average, over 3 years, we want the result to be mostly positive. But what happened from 2018 onwards? It tipped into deficit. We were spending more than we were receiving in income if we exclude these capital grants that we can only spend on certain purposes. And that was negative for a long time. It was very concerning in 2020. But look what's happened recently. It's heading in the right direction. You'll see in other graphs that things have improved, particularly in the last year. Now, if you know anything about big organizations and big businesses, you know it takes time to turn the ship around, particularly in council. There's lags with when you commit to spending. It can be a year or 2 years later before the project's finished. So I'm really heartened by this improvement in the last year. So now I'm going to show you what makes up those operating results that we've just looked at. Now, can I draw your attention to a couple of things on the graph? This is looking at before amalgamation and after amalgamation. For the before amalgamation period, all I did was combine the figures of Urena and Corowa respectively. That's perfectly sensible and a reasonable thing to do. Can I also draw your attention to the fact that these figures are in thousands of dollars. So it's not 18,000, it's 18 million. And there's 3 lines that I particularly want you to look at with respect to what happened after amalgamation. This dark blue line here is for the staff costs, and you can see they went up a lot. Now that will surprise and puzzle a lot of people, because the independent panel and KPMG and the state government told you were going to have all these marvellous savings from amalgamation. They were mostly going to happen in the area of staff expenses. Now, bona fide experts knew that wasn't the case, because we'd studied Queensland and we knew that there were things called diseconomies of scale too. But this is what's happened, and this explains part of our results. The other line I want you to look at is this orange line here, which is the contracts and materials costs. Now, this does not refer to new items that we built, but it does respond to that. If you're going to build new things, you're going to have to spend extra money maintaining them. And that tends to work with a 2-year lag or so, because obviously when you first build something, it doesn't need maintenance for a couple of years. Now, those costs have gone up dramatically. Part of it is because costs have increased across the board. You all know about inflation. A lot of it is also because we built new things, and that means we have new things to maintain. Also, part of the puzzle here is the inclement weather we had, all those floods and everything, and also is the bigger farm equipment that we have driving on roads causing more damage. So there's lots of pieces of these puzzles. The grey line also is a reflection of new assets in part. It's what we call depreciation, and that's the apportioning of costs of long life assets over the expected life of the asset. So if we build a bridge for $1 million and we think it's going to last for 10 years, instead of declaring the whole $1 million as an expense in the first year, we apportion 1/10 of that each year for a period of 10 years. It gives us a better view of the reflection of the consumption of the asset. Now, I hear people say this is an accounting trick. It's not. It's part of the Australian accounting standards, which are legislated, is required by law, and they're part of the International Financial Reporting Standards. So there's lots of pieces to this puzzle. Now I'm going to focus on a few of those components of expenditure in more detail. And the first one is the staff expenses here. I've put it in a nice bar graph. It's really simple to read. And I've compared the pre-amalgamation average to the post-amalgamation average. And you can see quite clearly that staff expenditure deflated by revenue, so I divided it by revenue so we can compare apples with apples as a fair comparison, did indeed increase significantly after amalgamation. And that happened across the state. That also happened in the Queensland amalgamations. That's exactly what I expected, and that's why the promises made to you by KPMG and the independent panel and all those things were never going to happen. And in fact, the cost increased by around 5.9%. Now, some of you will be saying, well, how does it compare to other councils? And to show you that, I've got to show you another type of graph. Now, you probably did learn this at school, but you've probably forgotten all about it. So let me remind you of what this type of graph means. This is what we call box and whisker plot. So above this line here is 25% of the councils. Below this line on the bottom here, the bottom of the rectangle, is 25% of the councils. So in the rectangles here, we have the middle 50% of the councils. And in fact, this line in the middle here is the median. It is the middle. So if you put the numbers in ascending order, picked out the middle number, that's it. And this cross that you can see here is the average, just like a cricketing average. Add up all the scores, divided by the number of scores, that's the average. Now, averages are quite misleading. Statisticians don't like them. We much prefer the median. Now, these lines here that come up are what's called outliers. They're unusual results, and if it's an extreme outlier, you might see some little dots like so. Now, your council, this will be the cohort we're comparing you to, and I'm comparing you to other OLG 11 councils just like you, such as Cootamundra, Gundagai, Hilltops, etc. And your particular council will be represented right next to it with a straight line like this, and you can see how you compare to the other councils. And as I say, in a 130-page report, there's lots and lots of graphs. You can knock yourself out reading these. I'm just picking out a couple of the things to highlight, because some people are concerned that the problem is that we have too much staff, and your staff expenditure has gone up. So one way of thinking about that is, how do you compare to other councils? Now, prior to amalgamation, as you can see, you win that bottom 25% all the time as staff expenditure per property assessment, per number of rate assessments. Now, what's happened since amalgamation? Well, amalgamation took place here in 2017, and what's happened since? It has moved up in relative terms, but you're still usually in the bottom 25% or perhaps slightly in that middle 50%. To say that you're overstaffed and that staffing is the problem, I think would be profoundly misleading, because compared to other councils that the state government tells you are in the same category as you, you are usually in the bottom 25%, maybe slightly into that next little quartile, but you certainly are well below typical expenditure per assessment in regards to staff expenditure. So now we're going to talk about IPPE, infrastructure, property, plant and equipment. Now, most of this is actually, it's your council assets, and most of it is your roads, but it's also things like buildings, cars, trucks, computer equipment, mobile phones, all sorts of things. Now, IPPE tends to go up, and from this graph you can see pre-amalgamation to post-amalgamation. It will go up because of revaluation, and we need to buy and build new things, and things cost more money over time. However, I think you can see quite clearly it's gone up more dramatically in the post-amalgamation period to what it did in the pre-amalgamation period. And in fact, it's gone up 50%. It's gone up from about 450 million up to about 670 million. Now, if your IPPE goes up around 50%, well, ultimately, most of that's going to be passed on into higher materials and contracts at costs and higher depreciation costs. And this is a burden we're going to have for many, many years. Now, what some people don't understand is that a lot of this new IPPE spending, the assets that sometimes irritate people, they talk about on all amalgamated communities, new playgrounds when their roads weren't traversable and the like. What a lot of people don't realise is that these new assets were mainly committed to during the administration period by the administrator. Things take several years to build sometimes, and that was the state government's appointed man. Now, what they also don't realise is that the state government is established this thing called Stronger Community Grants. That was shy of $1 billion. It was a lot of money, and it had to be spent in new discretionary nature assets. You know, things are more like a want rather than a need. Now, if we'd spent the money on roads and water pipes and sewer pipes, you wouldn't be in the situation you are at the moment. Instead, the money was spent on other things, and it seemed a little bit like Christmas. New assets were descending from the sky and no one was asking you to pay any extra for it. And that's unrealistic. It's like if you go to a shop, if you get something new, you have to pay for it. Now, part of what we're going to have to be asking for in a future SRV is the money to pay, in part, for these new things that you got. And it's a big problem if no one ever really pointed out to you that this is ultimately how things would have to work. Now, remember that first graph when we were looking at pre and post amalgamation and looking at all the deficits we had post amalgamation. Now, when you have a deficit, that can be reconciled in one of two main ways. Either you increase your liabilities or you have to raid your unrestricted cash, raid your piggy bank. And a bit of both has happened since amalgamation. So liabilities, the combined liabilities prior to amalgamation were about $13 million. Now they're about $30 million. The unrestricted cash prior to amalgamation was about $4.7 million. Now it's $2.8 million. Now we can see more clearly what's happening when we look at this in a comparative sense. But please remember that we're looking at OLG 11 councils, which are rural councils, which tend to be rather financially weak. And the reason why they're weak is they have lots of assets to maintain, particularly roads, and very few people to tax. So you can see that prior to amalgamation, you were pretty typical or above typical. Since amalgamation, you've been below typical in most years. things have improved a lot in the most recent year. And as I'll continue to say, that's great. I'll also continue to say with big organisations, it takes a year or two for changes to start flowing through. So that is really, really positive and really heartening that we've had this big improvement in the last year and we're more typical in terms of unrestricted cash. We still have far too little unrestricted cash. Typically you want 3 to 6 months of cash spending as your unrestricted reserves. So that'd be about $5 to $7 million, and we're not there. Also, this unrestricted cash has been boosted by staff vacancies. It's been boosted by land sales, but it's always a little bit more complicated than that. So this is my biggest concern. And this is one very big reason why we're going to have to ask you for an SRV, which is an issue that I'll talk about later. The good news is that your biggest asset, your staff, is in relatively good nick. I did a staff survey similar to yours. It's all laid out in the report, the results of it. We've got a couple areas where we urgently need to get some positions filled, but otherwise things are pretty good. And that contrasts starkly to other amalgamated councils I worked for. Most of them have a lot of problems with staffing, and I know people want to bag different people all the time, but you need to also give credit where credit's due. And I think the good staff that we have, the fact that we've even got staff, there's a lot of amalgamated councils that can't get key staff. The fact that we don't have that problem has to come back to your councillors and your most senior management. You just have to concede that whether you like it or not. And what I would encourage you all to do is get off the back of the staff. They are trying to do the best job possible. If you get off the back, give them a little bit of room, they will do the best job possible. Most of them live here. It's in their interest to do a good job too and to have Federation flourish. Give them a little bit of room to move. Give them a bit of consideration. It's hard for them too. Amalgamations are incredibly hard. And they've been in a tough situation for years now. It's hard for them to cooperate, help them. Because I tell you what, if you think you don't like things now, if you get in a situation that other amalgamated councils have been in where they've lost staff in droves and they haven't been able to replace them, then you really won't like things. So, yep, you're lucky, you've got good staff, treasure them, encourage them, cooperate with them, and help them as much as you can. So we're about to enter on to question number 2, but before I do, let me summarise. What is our situation? It's very serious. There's no sugarcoating it. It's a serious situation. And you already know that because the council went and asked you for a 74% SRV last year. Now you know some of the reasons why. And some of the reasons why are not what I've heard communities say. One of your biggest problems is that IPPE burden. Another problem is increasing staff costs, but they owe far more to the amalgamation than anything else, and so do you increasing materials and contract costs. So we're in a serious situation. Now we're going to find out how did we get there. And remember, the third question is probably the most important one, which is what can we do about it? And we can do a lot. The council's already started doing a fair bit. There's more that we can do, and I've got 61 recommendations for how we can improve things further. Now we answer the question, how do we get there? And to get to that answer, I've got to go back into some of the old things. And one of them is these T Corp ratings done in 2013. They formed the basis of who would amalgamate with whom and who would have to be amalgamated. They're done by the New South Wales Treasury Corporation based on 10 financial ratios. And scholars call that extreme synecdoche. It's a big no-no using just 10 ratios. It's like me describing 10 things about you, maybe your height, your weight, your eye colour, hair colour, etc., and telling people to go out into a crowd and pick you out. It's not going to happen. You just don't have enough detail there. When I look at financial sustainability, I look at 40 or 50 ratios, but most importantly, I look at context, because context is everything. So, T Corp said that Corowa had moderate sustainability and a negative outlook, and they ranked Urena one rank lower and said they were weak sustainability, neutral outlook. Well, they had it completely wrong way around. It's as simple as that. And I've shown empirically in the papers that the methods used by T Corp meant that the main reason why you got the rating was the summarization method that they used, the mathematical technique they used to summarize those 10 ratios. And the problem is this: in the north, they had mainly core services, very few discretionary services, very little growth. In the south, they had higher quality services, high expectation, higher growth, more discretionary services. And what that means is in the future, you're going to have to spend a lot more money than people are probably going to be wanting to pay. And for that reason, I actually think that the community in the south represents a bigger financial burden in terms of financial sustainability than the community in the north. And ordinarily, I wouldn't talk about that. But you know what? I've had that many people tell me, oh, the whole problem is that we're carrying URENA. Well, no, that's actually wrong. It's just plain wrong. You think about growth in particular. You think about places like Howlong and Moala that are growing, and Corowa itself. You know, every time you build a new block of houses, water pipes, sewer pipes, roads, gutters, footpath, lighting, eventually new sewer plants, new water plants, millions and millions of dollars. And I've shown empirically that the revenue doesn't keep up with the growth. So the more you grow, the worse you are actually off, because you're not getting enough revenue to keep up with the additional expenditure. So sorry, but T Corp got it wrong in 2013. And this table also provides us with some information. I took this from the 2016 financial statements. So they were signed off by the administrator at the time. They should have been relatively clear of misstatement and certainly clear of any political influence. And I've got the 2015 financial figures, which would have appeared on those, which did appear on those 2016 statements. And it's interesting to compare some of these things. So cost to bring assets to a satisfactory standard in Corowa, and I've represented it here in brackets as a percentage of revenue. Corowa is 58% of your revenue. In URENA, it was 48% of your revenue. So what we're saying here is this is what the council's reporting, is that the amount of money they needed to spend on their assets was a bigger proportion for Corowa than URENA, i.e. Corowa had more money to spend as a proportion of their revenue than URENA. Reserves. For Corowa, internally restricted, 19% of revenue. Unrestricted, 9% of revenue. URENA, much, much higher. Internally restricted, 54% of revenue. Unrestricted, 12% of revenue. So this goes to support what I just told you. T Corp got it wrong. So all those people saying you're carrying URENA, it's not the case at all. It just simply isn't the case, and it's borne out by audited financial statements produced by Federation Council, produced by the state government appointed administrator. And it's also interesting to look at the SRV situation at the time and what was being proposed. Now, it's interesting to me that when I talk to a lot of people in Federation Shire, they didn't even know that another SRV had been proposed by the former Corowa Shire just prior to the amalgamation. So for the 2013-14 year, they had the 7% SRV that was approved by IPART. Then they went back to IPART and secured another 31.08%. This is former Corowa Shire. And that was in hand, and as you know, because of the state's government decision about the rate path freeze, you got lumbered with that SRV, part of that SRV even after amalgamation. But many people don't know, and I've actually got the source document. I've got a screenshot of it in my report, because some people won't believe it, that the Corowa Shire was actually going out and talking about yet another SRV, and there was two options proposed. One was 52%, one was 37.65%. I think it's clear from there that Corowa realised they didn't have anywhere near enough revenue to cover their future expenses. I think it's also interesting that Corowa Shire was one of, I think, 2 councils across the whole state, 152 at the time, who voluntarily embraced amalgamation. It's very unusual, because councillors lose their job, senior management can lose their job. It's very unusual for them to embrace amalgamation. I think you put all those things together, lots of SRVs in hand, more significant large SRVs planned, and voluntarily embracing an amalgamation that ends up with you not having a job, I think that says that Corowa Shire realised they had some formidable financial sustainability challenges ahead of them. Urena wasn't in the clear either. In the documentation to IPART, they were proposing 4 years of 10%, which gets you to a cumulative 46.41%. The difference there was Urena hadn't actually put in for the SRV, so we don't know what they would have done. We don't know whether IPART would have approved it or not, whether IPART would have agreed they needed it or not. The ones that were in hand with Corowa, we know they were done. We know IPART agreed they needed to be done, and I cite from the IPART reports where they're suggesting that they knew that there was more to be done. So that's just the way things were, and I think that's different to what a lot of people are thinking. They're thinking that this amalgamated council suddenly sprung an SRV on you. Well, you'd had some SRVs already in Corowa and you were planning to have more, so there wasn't anything really sudden about it at all. Now, one of the big problems was this amalgamation. People were running around talking a lot of rubbish back in 2016, let's be honest about it. Now, I had peer-reviewed papers, 8 peer-reviewed papers in some of the best journals in the world, showing that the amalgamation wasn't going to save money. And in fact, in all but 3 instances, it was going to result in additional cost to the local government. So my work has been proven by time to be basically spot on. I take no joy from that. I knew it's going to happen. I did proper, robust, adult empirical work, not little spreadsheets and dodgy ratios. And I was also basing it on all my studies I'd done of the earlier Queensland amalgamations, where we also saw costs go up. So, I wasn't clairvoyant or anything. I was just basing this on proper, robust, rigorous work and evidence. Now, the problem is, people are running around. We had the Mr. Sampson's Independent Local Government Review Panel telling you we're going to save squillions drive on gold roads and not pay rates anymore. We had KPMG saying we were going to save $20 billion over 10 years or some such thing. We had Corowa Shire saying that you're going to save more than $40 million over 10 years. It was never going to happen. And I'm going to show you now why it wasn't happening. Can you keep an open mind? Bear in mind that this is proper, robust, rigorous work produced by 3 respected professors that do this for a living, and a lot of it's been peer reviewed. Now, a little bit more information. Before the amalgamation happened, the way that the state government at the time pursued the legislation is this. They nominated delegates who would review the minister's proposal, which was based on KPMG's guess and giggle work. Those delegates produced a report. Your delegate ended up being your administrator, which was interesting. And then the Boundaries Commission had to comment on the report. Now, most people agree, and I've written it in the scholarly literature, that the Boundary Commission was basically rubber stamping everything. They weren't going out of their way to find problems. It was quite unusual if you go and look at all their reports, which I've done in court cases. I was expert witness in court cases. It's quite unusual for them to say anything negative. Now, this is what the Boundaries Commission said about the delegate's report for Federation Shire. This is the delegate who later became your administrator. Overall, the Commission's view is that the report shows that the delegate adequately considered all the factors. Now, this is key, with the exception of wards and diverse communities. Now, why is that key? Well, this is actually legislation. Section 263(3) of the Local Government Act 1993. You can look it up yourself, and they're 2 of the subsections, the wards and diverse communities. So 2 pieces of the legislation weren't considered, the Boundaries Commission say. So the law had not been satisfied. And I've got very little doubt, had it been challenged, that you probably would have had the proposal sent back to the delegate to do more work on before it could proceed forward, because we don't get to choose whether we satisfy the terms of the law or not. We actually have to do it. Now, it's not me saying he didn't satisfy the law. This is the Boundaries Commission, established in part by the state government of New South Wales to advise the minister, who are saying that 2 parts of the law weren't done. Okay, so it's them saying it, it's not me. And further into the Boundaries Commission report and the delegates' work, they talk about these financials as a key part of the legislation. And this was what the amalgamations were largely based on. This is why it's so important to talk about this particular point. The financial advantages and disadvantages, and it says in the legislation, including economies and diseconomies of scale for the residents and ratepayers, must be considered. And this is what the Commission said, that they think the delegate adequately considered the issues under this factor, but here's the caveat, which puts doubt into whether he fully satisfied the law, because they note the lack of analysis in the report of economies and diseconomies of scale. Now, the minister's report and minister's proposal didn't have adequate analysis of it. Now, under the law, all you got to do is consider it. You don't have to have a sensible consideration or sensible comments. All you've got to do is show that you actually did consider the matter. Now, in the next slides, I'm going to talk about what economies of scale are and diseconomies of scale. And I'm going to show you actual proper growing up empirical evidence, stuff that I've done that's been published in the peer-reviewed literature in the best journals in the world, which is at odds with the guess and giggle spreadsheet stuff that KPMG did for the minister. So what are all these economies and diseconomies of scale all about? Well, this is a problem. The minister, the KPMG, the independent panel, they had no idea what they were about. And the Boundaries Commission has since written in the reports about it, quoting Wikipedia, which suggests to me that they didn't know much about it either. Now, as you've already discovered, I'm an incredibly boring person. That's because I'm a professor of economics, and this is what we do. We set out to bore our students to sleep. And there's probably the first lecture in most Econ 101s, back when I taught undergraduate course, where we start talking about Adam Smith. Now, we like to talk about Adam Smith because he's the father of economics and our guru, and he wrote this book in 1787, I think it was, called The Wealth of Nations. And he talks about these economies of scale. And what is it? It's the idea that as output increases, if you produce more items, that sometimes average total costs can reduce. And it's only sometimes. And no economist believes it's always. It's sometimes, in some cases. When it does reduce, that's called economies of scale. And it does so because people can specialise. And if you specialise in one thing all day, you tend to be quicker. And the example Adam Smith talks about is making haberdashery pins. You know, pins for sewing and things like that. So apparently in the olden days, people cut the piece of wire, sharpen one end, solder a head on, and they'd do the whole task. And he went to a factory overseas and he saw that they'd specialise. One person just sat there cutting wire all day, another person just sat there sharpening ends all day, another person just sat there all day soldering heads on. And he said that because of that specialisation, they were able to produce 240 times more pins for the same costs in materials and labour. So that's the great thing of specialisation. There's also potential economies of scale to save money because of better purchasing power. Sometimes when you're buying more, you can get it cheaper. And there's also the potential, if you've got equipment, say you had a water pump that could pump out enough water for 100,000 people, but it's only currently doing 50,000. Well, if you doubled the amount of people that were living in the area, you could use that surplus capacity better and therefore get more effective value out of that water pump. But, and this is why it's important to know how boring I am, by this point in time, everyone who goes on to become a minister of local government or an advisor to a minister or a commercial consultant has fallen to sleep because they don't hear the rest of the sentence story. And the rest of the story is that economies of scale, if they do exist, they get exhausted really quickly, after which time we expect a lengthy period of constant returns to scale where there's no real change in average total price as we produce more, as we increase production. And if we're silly enough to push the parcel even further, we'll eventually go into what's called diseconomies of scale. Now that's when your average total cost is going up as you produce more. And why might that happen? If you've ever worked in a small organisation or a bigger organisation, you know the answers already. In bigger organisations, you have less transparency. In bigger organisation, you have higher management costs. The managers want to be paid more because they're responsible for bigger budgets and more staff, and you need a new layer of middle management to coordinate between the top dogs and the people actually doing the work. An investment might have to be made because you've exhausted the capacity of your capital equipment. You also lose a lot of transparency, and you can lose some accountability and stewardship. So if you managed to get all the way through that last slide, you now know more than all the people who have been advising all our ministers and our ministers in the recent past. In lots of states, it's not just New South Wales. Now, on this graph, you can see what it looks like when we talk about economies of scale. That's this section here. You see how the costs are going down as the output's increasing? That's economies of scale. This section here where it's flat is what we call constant returns to scale. And this section here, if we're still enough to keep passing the parcel, is when the costs start increasing, average total costs increase as we increase output more. Now, if the curve is really steep like curve B here, there's lots of money to be saved. Now, it might be worth destroying people's lives over it. I don't know. That's a decision, a moral decision that needs to be made. But you know what? Typically, people don't even measure whether economies of scale exist or not. None of the people involved in 2016 did. The so-called independent expert panel led by so-called Professor Sampson didn't do it. KPMG didn't do it. The minister didn't do it. Scholars did. I published papers showing that they didn't exist for rural local governments. But unfortunately, most people didn't bother to measure whether these magical things called economies of scale were even there in the first place. But we also need to think about how much the costs are reducing as output increases. So you can see in curve A here, it's quite flat. If you're only saving a fraction of a cent per unit, it may not be enough to recoup the cost, the extra costs that happen as a result of amalgamation. It certainly probably isn't enough to justify ruining people's lives and livelihoods over. So these are key questions that should have been answered back in 2016. Now I'm going to show you the evidence. Now my trade, my stock in trade is I'm what's called an econometrician. I do the ghastly maths that no one else wants to do that's required for economics. So my first degree was in physical maths. And that's probably the reason why my hairline's receding and my hair's going grey and I'm working for a number of universities overseas because no one else wants to do it. Now, it's really hard to explain econometrics. It's something that we teach. You do a 2 years master's course to learn. So I'm not going to tell you in 2 minutes, but I want to give you an idea of what it's like. And to do that, I need you to do me a favor. I need you to close your eyes and think back to the best moment in your whole life. And I know exactly what you're thinking about. You're sitting in a maths classroom, because I used to be a maths teacher, a year 8 maths classroom, and your teacher's just told you that y equals mx plus c. And you'll recall something like this. You get the formula y equals mx plus c. You got all these dots in. You draw a line of best fit, come up with that formula. Then if I give you the value of x and you know what the m and the c is, you can work out what the y is and vice versa. Once you've got that formula, you can do lots of tricky things. Okay, well, you did that with straight lines and you may or may not have enjoyed it. What I do is like that on absolute steroids. Instead of a straight line, imagine you're in the middle of the Earth and the globe. It's spinning, you're in the middle, and it's also moving through time and space. I'm doing it on multiple dimensions like that, and that explains why I'm such a boring, stressed person. So I did that exercise for you, and I've done it in other papers, and they've been peer-reviewed, published in the best journals in the world. And as I say, I work for 3 unis overseas. I must know what I'm doing, okay? So I did that for the entire state. And what we're interested in here are these two figures here, population squared. And to make it simple for you, what we're really interested in these stars here. See the 2 stars? That means it's statistically significant. That means there's a statistical association between population and what we're regressing it against, which is unit expenditure. And if that exists, economies of scale probably do exist. Okay, and this is the highest level of statistical certainty, the sort of tools that we use for really important things for when we are proving medicines and the like. Now, for the entire state, as you can see, there are economies of scale because population and population squared both have asterisks next to them. But if you know anything about New South Wales and local government, you know that councils in the bush do completely different things to councils in the city. For instance, we have dirt roads instead of bitumen roads sometimes. We usually do sewage, we usually do water, we usually address market failure and government failure. City councils don't do those things. So what scholars do, because they're really different entities, is we do stratification. So we rerun that regression and we look at just the rural councils. And what do you see? When we just look at the rural councils, what happened to those stars? They disappeared. Population squared is no longer statistically significant. There are no economies of scale. There is no evidence of economies of scale for rural local governments. It's beyond dispute. This has also been checked by my two professor colleagues in your report, and I have the full details and the formulas and everything else in the report. You can knock yourself out. Long panel, 2013 to 2022. So I don't think any reasonable person would dispute this finding. Now, I'll say that again because this is critical. Your amalgamation was predicated on these economies of scale. That's where all those amazing savings were supposed to occur. And I've just shown you, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that those economies of scale did not exist. Now, wouldn't it have been great if the independent panel or KPMG or the Minister's Department had done the same analysis? Or even read my papers online prior to amalgamation, because we could have saved ourselves a lot of pain. Now, there is another figure here that's worth talking about, and that's population density. There's also a thing called economies of density. The closer houses are, the cheaper is the service. Why? Think about rubbish collection, for instance. If houses are 10 metres away, you drive your truck 10 metres to get from one rubbish bin to another. That's going to be cheaper than if houses are a couple hundred metres away from each other, because you'd have to drive further. Same with water pipes, sewer pipes, length of roads, all sorts of things. Now, as you can see from the stars here, there are economies of density statewide. But when we go to the rural stratification, you see the actual number gets larger in magnitude, and those economies of density become more important. And basically, they smother any potential for economies of scale, because density is the key fact for rural local government, not population size. So there are no economies of scale for rural councils. So we shouldn't be surprised that you didn't save money. In fact, it costs money, as I show throughout my report in various sophisticated mathematical techniques, which I fully lay out. That's why you've got to read the whole report. But something else comes interesting for this. If I do another regression looking at the association between those financial sustainability ratios, the ones the state government makes you report on, their ratios, not mine, and compare that to size, what do we find? For the whole state, we find a statistically significant association, but look at the sign here, it's negative. So as councils get bigger, financial sustainability reduces. It's beyond dispute. This particular regression has just currently been accepted for publication now in a peer-reviewed journal, the best in Australia. For urban, that's also the cases, negative, statistically significant. And for rural councils, that's also the case, negative and statistically significant. So what I'm telling you supports what I was saying before about TCorp getting the ratings wrong. The empirical evidence based on the state government's own financial sustainability metrics that they mandate says that as councils get bigger, they get less sustainable. It's just a fact. I can't do anything about it. I imagine lots of people don't like it. Now, I made promises to lots of people prior to amalgamation that I would continue to monitor what happened afterwards. I was prepared. If the results showed that I was wrong, I would have still published the results. I'm prepared to be responsible for my work. I knew, though, that robust empirical work isn't going to be wrong, and guesswork is very unlikely to be right. So I did this thing called difference in difference regression, and it's even more tricky than what I normally do. But basically, to make it simple for you, have a look at this graph. What we're trying to do is predict what would have happened to the amalgamated councils based on the trend of what happened to a control group, the group of councils that weren't amalgamated, in the future, and then compare what actually did happen to what would have happened had the trend that had been established and statistically proven had continued. And that will tell us the effect of the amalgamation itself. It's called difference in difference regression, and I'll show you the results in a second. And I won't labour the point because I go through each paper in my YouTube channel. If you ever want to watch any of those videos, type in Professor Joseph Drew, they'll pop up, find the video. But 3 of the best journals in the world, all are ranked by our federal government as being the best journals in the world. And we've shown that amalgamation increased cost by 11%. The next paper, the next year after, showed that amalgamation increased unit cost by 11%. The next paper, this is actually in the best journal in the world, showed that amalgamation increased unit cost by over 11%. So amalgamation, it is beyond reasonable doubt that amalgamation has increased unit costs for your council. And if you're inclined to ignore academic evidence and peer-reviewed work in the best journals in the world, there's another way of thinking about it. Have a look at the special rate variations for councils that were amalgamated. Here's a whole heap of them. Armidale, 59%. Federation, 39%. Snowy Monaro, 52%. Snowy Valleys, 36%. They're probably going for another one shortly. Canterbury Bankstown, 36%. Cootamundra Gundagai, 53.5%, etc. So it's pretty evident that amalgamation didn't stop rates from going up, which is what you were told they were going to do. And it's pretty evident that those billions of dollars in savings never occurred, because if they had have occurred, people wouldn't be going for special rate variations and IPART wouldn't be approving them. And as you know, IPART is quite rigorous in their approval. So when they approve it, they're basically confirming for us that the amalgamation resulted in rates having to go up. It's as simple as that. So I used my super duper difference regression analysis to predict what your costs should have done had you kept to the trends that were happening in other amalgamated councils, including the effect of changes in demographic in your local government area. And what do you see here? The prediction is the blue line, okay? And in 2016, what do you see the model predicts? The model predicts, I'll give you the precise figure, it predicts that your costs would have gone up by 22%. Now, as it turns out, in that particular year, it was a little bit less, and the next year, it was a little bit less. In the following years, it was a lot more, but notice the blue line hasn't gone down. That's a permanent increase and jump as a result of amalgamation. 2022, as I said, this last year, and it takes a few years to turn a big ship around, this last year we've dipped below what the computer model, the proper model, a proper grown-up econometric model, not the guesswork stuff that commercial consultants have done for you in the past, proper model, it's just dipped below that. So that's showing that you're doing better than predicted. That's good, and we need to do better even still. Now, to further clarify matters for you, I got one of the 2 best people in the world to do what's called a data and development analysis. The maths is even more complicated than the difference regressions that I do. I have done DEA before. I published in one of the best journals in America on this stuff before, but I wanted to get you the best in the world. So we got Professor Ferreira to do it. I wanted an independent voice because I don't want you just to be hearing from me. And he did what's called data and development analysis. You can see the formula up here on the screen. It's really, really painful, really, really boring, and I don't think anyone wants to know about it. But if you do, there's more details in the report, and I refer you in the report to some works, and you can read whole books on the thing. But all you really need to look at is Federation's results. And basically, this is the green line here, and we're talking about scale. And it goes from 0, you've got completely rubbish scale, to 1, or 100% if you want to times it by 100 and turn it into a percent, which means you've got completely perfect scale. And you can see that Federation scale's far from perfect. Now, to put it in numerical numbers for you, your scale is reducing your efficiency by 60%. That is just an empirical fact done by one of the best people in the world, and it can't be argued. And after Professor Ferreira did the analysis, I wish I recorded what he said because it was just priceless, and it's how I feel, guys. He said, oh, look, I did this DEA analysis. It takes weeks to do the maths for it. And the efficiency is really, really bad, and that council's really overscaled. It's far too big. And the next thing he said, because he asked me how big it was, and I told him how many thousands of hectares it was. And he said, "Are you Australians certifiably insane? We have countries in Europe smaller than your local government area, and you're wondering why they're not efficient." You only have to go to a map and look at the different sizes of countries. I counted 31 countries that are smaller than Federation Shire. So it's hardly surprising that you have a problem. And it's even more tricky than that, because most of the population sitting down here near the river, and the rest of it is very, very dispersed. Now, if you're going to fix a road, you need to take your equipment and your staff from wherever it happens to be, say it's in Corowa, all the way up to Daysdale to fix that road. And I note that the Boundaries Commission, the delegate, said, oh, you can do things on Zoom. But you know what? You can't Zoom a bulldozer. You can't Zoom staff. And we don't have a TARDIS either. So whilst all that is happening, money is literally going up in smoke, exhaust smoke. Your scale is insane, like Professor Ferreira said. It's just too big. It's going to cost money because you're constantly traveling to do things. And when staff are sitting in a car, you're paying them, and they're not doing the work that you would normally have them doing. They're driving, and they've got to drive home. And it's disrupting what they would normally do. And it's they need time to settle back into the job when they get back to work. It creates a lot of inefficiency, this really strange scale. And I don't know what the people who were thinking about this boundary review were doing. Did they drive between these places? Because I still haven't got up to some of the places in your local government area. It's just massive. Now, one of the other things that by law you have to look at is whether wards would help or not, and how you're going to have adequate voice. And the Boundaries Commission's already said that these things weren't looked at properly, which means the law wasn't observed. And it's simple arithmetic, really. In here in this table, you can see the number of enrolled voters in 2012. You do the arithmetic based on 9 councillors, and what does it tell you? It tells you the people in the former Urannah local government shire area, if they all vote together in a block, can get 0.88 of a councillor. Now this time they happen to get 2, but it's way preferences fell and things like that. Is it reasonable for what used to be a whole shire to only be able to have maybe, on a good day, 1 person at the table? It's not really democracy, is it? And I find it particularly unusual and strange, because we're overseas, sending weapons overseas to kill people because we think democracy is an important concept, and yet we have a whole community completely disenfranchised. And this is a problem. And I suggest that the reason why the delegate didn't look at this is there's no good answer to it. Creating wards won't fix it. And it is unreasonable to argue that the people in the north have a proper political voice anymore, because they don't. The simple arithmetic tells you that. Now, one partial mitigation, and I go into a few suggestions in the report, is to increase the number of councillors to 12, and I highly recommend it. You never want to be in the situation, and you will be in it eventually, that with 9 councillors, you have no one from that north at all. That'd just be completely wrong. And it poses a lot of risk and a lot of burnout, because that one councillor's got an awful lot of area to travel around. And by the way, if you're complaining about the mileage of the people up there, think about how far they've got to drive to do their job. That probably explains it. So, unfortunately, under the current legislation, it's got to go to referendum, and I've got to rely on the goodwill of the people in the south to think about it and go, look, fair go, yeah, we're going to have to put it up to 12 councillors. I know you don't want another 3 councillors. No one wants more politicians. I certainly don't. But you've got to be fair, guys, honestly. Please, if it goes up to a referendum, vote for it to go up to 12, because I just never want to see the situation where the people in the former Urannah Shire can't even get 1 person at the table. That's just plain wrong. Now, a similar mathematical technique to DEA that Professor Ferreira did for us to show us the scale problem is called FDH. Now, you don't need to know the detail. The formula's up there. In the report, I talk about the differences between DEA and FDH. But basically, you can measure the efficiency of a council relative to other similar rural councils over time, and you can give them a score. And 0 means they're absolute rubbish, and 1 means they've got perfect efficiency. And you can adjust by introducing a constraint into the model. You probably see the constraint there, the 1 that's been added in there. You can adjust for scale, so you're not comparing, so you are comparing apples with apples. And when you adjust for scale, you'll get an accurate reading of your efficiency, taking into account the fact that you've got this ridiculous scale that is a weight around your council and makes it very hard for it to deliver services efficiently. Now, when you do that, here's Federation score, you're still green. And what do you notice? You're mostly 100% efficient. 2020 wasn't a good year, but you were still better than a whole heap of other rural councils. And this last year wasn't quite perfect. But in most years, Federation Council is working at its highest level of efficiency or very close to it. Now, this work was also done by Professor Ferreira, the best in the world. It's a mathematical technique. He's sitting in Portugal. He has no axe to grind. It's been in lots of peer-reviewed journals before. There's no debate by any econometrician or economist whether the technique is robust or not. And I know this result does not suit the agenda of an awful lot of people, but in most years, given your ridiculous scale, your council's doing as good as it can. But of course, that doesn't mean that we can't do better than great. And in fact, we're going to have to do better than great given our financial situation. Now, one of the other things I want to talk about is these financial assistance grants, and particularly this period 2016, 17, 18, and 19. Now, what are financial assistance grants? It's money that's given up by the Commonwealth Government. It's controlled by a piece of federal legislation, but it's the New South Wales Local Government Grants Commission that divvies up the money, supposedly in accordance with the legislation. And one of the disadvantages for you for amalgamation was always going to be the fact that you were going to get less general component grant money. Now, grants is about, typically in most rural councils, about a third of your revenues. It's a big deal. Now, why would it go down? Because grants are supposed to be allocated according to need. So lower socio-demographic areas should get more money than higher socio-demographic areas. Now, the problem is you amalgamated the north, had about 10% of the population, much lower socio-demographic area than the south. Now, way averages work is the south's going to skew the data up. As a result, overall, it's going to look like you have higher demographics than what you had previously. I know nothing's actually changed on the ground, but this is the way the numbers will work. And as a result, your general component grants will go down in relative terms. They go up every year because they're indexed to inflation, but in relative terms, they would go down. Now, the federal legislation realizes that this is a problem with amalgamation. The legislation says that for a period of 4 years, you cannot get less money than had we worked out the grants separately for each council, form a council, and then added them together. Now, then this result becomes very hard to explain because you can see here's the average on the orange line, it's going up, but you can see your result, particularly in that first year, actually went slightly down and was quite flat in the other year. So it suggests to me that you probably weren't given the grant money that you should have been given, that the federal law says you should have been given. But it gets even more complicated, and this is all detailed in my report. The federal law says it must be transparent and accountable. However, our New South Wales Grants Commission doesn't think that that part of the law applies to them in the way that I think it applies to them. One of those years, they didn't even produce a report to say what they did. In other years, they haven't outlined the formulas, so I can't check whether they did the right thing or not. So I've suggested that your councillors write to the Minister and perhaps even the Federal Treasurer and say, was the law obeyed in this instance? My suggestion, I think you can see from this graph and the figures in the report, is that it probably wasn't. Now, I'm conscious of time and you can read this table for yourself, but this is just a numerical representation of the graph you just saw, and that makes it even clearer to me that chances are we didn't obey the law. And the other thing I want you to remember, though, is that that protection only lasts for 4 years after the law. After that, your general component in relative terms will reduce because of what I said. Most of the people in the South were the higher demographic, and that's 90% of your population. It's going to skew results. So that's a real problem. Another real problem is your road grants. So, remember how to read box and whisker plots? Here's you, that's the line. Here's your OLG, other OLG 11 councils that the state government said are just like you. And you can see from that the road grant you get is the very lowest amongst your cohort on a per kilometre basis. Now that's really surprising because the legislation says quite clearly that the money needs to be allocated according to the principle of horizontal fiscal equalisation. And the legislation defines what that means, and it says that it means that councils doing reasonable things should be able to provide the same level of basic services as any other council in the state. That's what the legislation says, i.e., it shouldn't matter what your postcode is, you should be able to get basic services. Now, if you've driven around New South Wales, you know that the services in the city are awesome, and the services in rural areas like where I live in Moonbi are pretty darn sad. So clearly the HFE objective is not be met. Now, just to bring this point out for you, I've given you the figures on a per kilometre basis for the road grants. This is Commonwealth money, remember, that's dictated by Commonwealth law that the state government's allocating. And it's supposed to be on the basis of HFE. You're getting $1,180 per kilometre. North Sydney, where the richest people in the country live, they're getting $3,500 per kilometre. The City of Sydney are getting $5,000 per kilometre. How is that horizontal fiscal equalisation? And I've suggested to your councillors that they write to the Minister and perhaps the Treasurer and ask him precisely that question. So, in summary, the amalgamation made things worse. The models, the proper robust empirical models, suggest it made it about 22% worse. Across the state, it made things about 11% worse. It wasn't as bad for city amalgamations as it was for rural amalgamations because it's that economies of density which is the key factor in what happens with your costs. Furthermore, you seem to have been shorted on the FAG grants, the Commonwealth grant money, both in the general grant component, which would have been going down, and that's a disadvantage of amalgamation that should have been picked up by the Boundaries Commission and the delegate and the minister, according to the Lord. And you also appear to be shorted on your grants per kilometre, and that's certainly not helping. But despite all that, despite the ridiculous scale, which is a 60% lead weight around your council's neck, in most years when we adjust for scale, the sophisticated maths says that you're doing about as good as you can. But given our financial circumstances, it's clear that we just have to do better. And that's where we go now. The third and last question, where can we go next? Now, the report is very lengthy. As I said, it's 130 odd pages, and I've had to race through it in just over an hour. And I haven't quite kept to the time either. I acknowledge that. What I go through in the report is a whole heap of recommendations. Now, the councillors are getting a numbered list of the recommendations. If you want my 2 cents, I don't think that's a public document. I think the report is a public document, and in that report you can find all the material that gets you to the recommendations, but the recommendations is an operational document, and I don't think it would be wise or helpful to give it to the public. But I'll go through some of these now. What's concerning me most is that some people in the past may have considered the special rate variation to be a one silver bullet. And it's not. It's never going to be. Now, I always tell people, think about your personal budget. I can remember I bought my first house at 20 and I really shouldn't have got the loan for it, but I was working for the Commonwealth Bank at the time and I did get the loan for it. And I discovered very quickly that I was spending more money with the loan repayments and food than what I was earning. You know what? When you get in that situation, there's no single fix. There's a whole heap of little fixes. And one of the things you can do is earn more. And I got a job delivering pizzas for Arnold's Pizzas and Ribs. And I got a job at Woolworths as well, packing shelves, and I was working all day through the bank. That's one option. I took in the border. Option number 2 is you can cut back your expenses. And I learnt the delights of cup of soup, noodles, and home brand coffee. And yes, it is disgusting. And indeed, I waited most mornings till I was in the workplace to have my coffee, and then it was free. And that's basically how this story goes. There will be no one solution. I've got 60 odd solutions in my report embedded in there. You can find them yourself. It's going to be a whole heap of things. SRV is definitely one of the things, but there's many, many pieces to the puzzle, and most of those pieces will not be appetizing. You won't like them, just like I don't like to drink home brand coffee, and you don't like to drink home brand coffee. But this is a problem. Everyone wants an easy way out, or way out that doesn't affect them personally. It doesn't exist. You're all going to suffer some pain. I'm just giving it to you straight. There's no point pretending that you won't. But what we need to do is make sure we do this in a way that leads to a sustainable result, and that shares the burden in a morally defensible fashion. So there's 60 odd recommendations. I obviously don't have time to go through them all, but I'm going to talk about the 5 major themes that drive these recommendations. The first is pricing strategy. We need to price things correctly to their full cost, including the cost of overheads, including the cost of future capital spending. Because if we don't, what it means is that the ratepayer is effectively subsidising the consumption of someone's private good or service. It'd be like me going to Woolies, buying a cherry ripe chocolate bar and asking you to all pop in a cent because I don't want to have to pay the $2 for 50 for a chocolate bar. Life doesn't work like that. So for private goods and services, you should be paying the full price. So expect a whole heap of your prices for things from council to go up. The next thing is we need to de-risk, particularly for those discretionary parts of the business that council does not have to run. Its core business of things like roads, rates, rubbish, water, sewer. They have to do those things. A whole heap of other things are more discretionary in nature. Now, some of those things need to go. Some of the things that more or less get run as a commercial operation, we need to think about whether it's reasonable for the ratepayer to absorb the risk if that commercial operation goes wrong. If it's reasonable for the local economy for council to be running that commercial operation, given that we all know that governments can't run business, and if people in government wanted to run business, they'd probably be in private business anyway. And in some cases, divest services and perhaps even assets. The next key point is the New South Wales government. We need to ask them to investigate whether we're getting a fair allocation of that Commonwealth government grant money. We need to ask them to investigate whether we got what we were legally entitled to for those 4 years. We need them to help us with fixing and mitigating this political disenfranchisement. There's lots of things the state government can do to help us, and I've made specific suggestions, and I'm suggesting to the councillors they write to the minister and ask them for help on those matters. The next thing we need to do is continue to look after our staff, continue to treasure them, get off their back and give them a chance to do their job. There's some staff shortages that I've said in my report urgently need to be redressed, whether we've got the money or not. I'm also concerned to get better retention policies in place and better succession policies in place. As I say, it's remarkable you've got the staff you have. Most amalgamated councils in rural areas haven't. I want to make sure you never get in that disagreeable position where you can't get the right staff. And the last element is to get back to basics. We need to be maintaining our roads. Probably the most important thing, and that really worries me if we're not, because if we're not doing maintenance, that's every bit as much a debt as a debt that we might have with the bank, because if you don't do maintenance, eventually it catches up with you. Now, to put it in perspective for you, to reseal, just to put the top surface on a kilometre of road, is about $30,000. If you don't do it every 10 or 12 years when you're supposed to, it depends on your particular circumstances and your environment, and the whole road collapses and you need to rebuild it from scratch, it's 10 times as much money. Now, we haven't been doing enough of that basic stuff because the state government's been having us build bike tracks and playgrounds and toilet blocks and all these other things, and we're short of staff in some areas and things like that. I want us to go back to basics. I want you as a community to realise that needs will be addressed in the future, and if we ever have any money left over, we can look at wants, but until that time, wants just aren't happening anymore. And that's your part you can play in the situation, is to not ask for any wants and just accept that until we get on top of needs, nothing else can happen. Now, an SRV will have to happen. Your rates are only about 32% of your revenue. That's why it's not the whole solution. There's 2/3 of your revenue not covered by rates, so it's never going to fix it. There's talk about your average rates being the lowest in the state or whatever the conversation was. I've put out a YouTube video that I directed you to that shows you that talking about average rates is completely misleading and an exercise in futility. It gets us nowhere. We need to do the work properly. You do have a temporary SRV at present. You are clearly going to have a permanent one. I just can't see how you could conceive that you couldn't. We need to start turning these deficits into surpluses, and we've got to catch up on decades of neglect in various areas. These problems go back decades, as I've shown you with SRVs in the past and SRV plans in the past and T-Corp assessments and everything else. There's nothing that just occurred last year. It's been brewing for decades. I went back 2009 in my records and it's evident then. So a permanent SRV will be necessary. Lots need to be done before we even get to that. Expect it in the 25-26 financial year, and expect a much more strategic one. We don't have to go for 10 years worth of money to go through the long-term financial plan. We do have to go for at least 5 or 6 years worth of money. And I would encourage council to get independent people involved in the SRV. I would encourage you to approach it with an open mind and realise that there is no alternative. If we don't put up rates, if we don't start balancing the budget, what you're saying is that you're happy for your children and your grandchildren to pay for things you're consuming now, which is just morally wrong, and that you're happy ultimately not to have a council, because ultimately we'll get to crunch point and you won't have a council. And if you don't like things now, go and talk to people in Central Darling Shire who have been in administration since 2012. Reflect on your own period of administration. And I think you'll realise that things could be a lot worse. Remember, your councillors are ratepayers too. Your staff are usually ratepayers too. They don't enjoy rates going up either. We'll only do what's absolutely necessary. But I'm afraid things are absolutely necessary. Now, as I've said many, many times, there's no substitute for reading the whole report. The whole report's going to be 130 plus pages. I strongly encourage you to read it. Now, if you want to have a go at me about not covering everything tonight, fair go, guys. 130 pages. I had just over an hour to talk to you. Obviously, I'm not going to get through everything. That's why you need to read the report. But most importantly, I have hope. If it was hopeless, I would tell you, because I don't believe in raising people's expectations unrealistically. We can create a much better Federation Shire, and I want you to. I think your councillors know what's required and are prepared to do it. I think your senior staff and staff are prepared to do it. I think that's what you want as well. And I think if we all cooperate and get on the same page, we will do it. But we need to get back to that key idea. What's the purpose of government? It's cooperation. And we need to cooperate again and work together. This report gives us a pathway forward. And I'm hoping you'll embrace it and move forward so that we can have that brighter future. Look, time for your survey now. Fill it out. The link will pop up if you're watching the electronic version at the end of this video. It's actually easier than filling in the paper form. And I will be incorporating your feedback where it's supported by the evidence and the theory in the final report. So please give me your feedback. Don't write pages and pages. I've got to read every single one. There's a small space for a sentence or two. Please focus on that couple sentences, and I promise I'll do my best to reflect your feedback as it concords with the evidence and the theory. Look, thank you very much for your attention. Remember, get the whole report, read it, enjoy it. If you've really developed a taste for local government economics, go and look at my YouTube channel, Professor Joseph Drew. Lots and lots of videos. You'll see that I'm doing a consistent message all the time, because these things are based on facts and empirical evidence. I go through lots of my papers and explain them. I explain econometrics, all sorts of things, so you can knock yourself out, and this joy of learning about local government economics can continue forever. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.